we'll go ahead and get started, even though people are still joining. So thank you all for being here today. My name is Jeffrey Berry. I am the CEO of Tennessee Environmental Council, and we are presenting today's webinar about how to build, maintain, and understand your pollinator garden, and how to care for it throughout the year, how to identify the plants. And I don't want to steal any thunder because if you just stay with us here, we will go through a full presentation, joined by Monica Pretz, who is our garden field volunteer coordinator, and Gwendolyn Blanton, which is our program coordinator for the pollinator program, which we will be talking about now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get into our slide presentation, and get started. By the way, our pollinator program is called Generate Some Buzz. But as you know, as an allusion to the buzz of a bee, but pollinators are not just bees, as we all know. So welcome to Generate Some Buzz. Tennessee Environmental Council is an organization, a nonprofit, a statewide nonprofit founded in 1970. Our mission is helping people and communities improve our environment. Our vision, what are we working toward in an improved environment, includes thriving habitats, a circular economy, and climate balance in Tennessee. So we've created a number of programs for you to get involved towards those aspirational goals. The Tennessee Tree Program, Watershed Support, Generate Some Buzz, which we're talking about today, Recycle Tennessee, Compost Your Compost, our Zero Waste Education Program, and more. So make sure you check out our website to learn more about those programs and how to get involved in making a difference in every aspect of your life. Because everything we do makes a difference, and that is what is required to solve the great environmental challenges of our days for our involvement in that. The challenge we're talking about today is the decline in pollinator insects globally. And most of you probably already know that pollinator insects, the butterflies and the bees that pollinate our plants worldwide, have been declining for decades, significantly. And the monarchs were almost on the threatened list because, or they were going endangered, but they seem to be making a slight rebound, perhaps because more people are building habitats. But we can do something about that. We can reverse the pollinator decline, or at least do our part in creating habitat for these essential insects, because they do pollinate more than 75% of all flowering plants worldwide. So think of all the food and plants globally that are being supported that could not exist without pollinator insects. It's a global interconnected web. And we can make a difference in that for ecological health and feeding our future. So Tennessee Environmental Council, in order to create programs that are more accessible for people to get involved in these solutions and make it easy and fun for people, we created this program, Generate Some Buzz, our pollinator program, in 2019. That's when we launched it. And we're really pleased how well it has worked, and people that have signed up to participate. The whole point of this program is to show everybody that we can do our part in starting our own pollinator gardens at home in the community. This program is supported by NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and USDA. Those were the seed grants that got us started. And TVA has provided a lot of support to allow us to expand our program. And we have numerous other sponsors as well. Now, how do you build a garden? We're going to go briefly over the basics. We have 3 techniques that we recommend, that we use. And the goal of this technique is to remove as much of the weed and seed bank as possible from the surface, so that the pollinators we want to grow, the plants that we want to grow that support and feed our pollinator species and insects and such, that there's less competition for that. And we will show you more about this later. But you can build by hand, dig out the sod by hand, remove it, get it out of there, put it in the corner of your yard. You can use a machine, a sod cutter, or if you're really doing a larger plot, we recommend the skid steer. But you can do it by hand, the whole thing. It depends on how many people you have and how much energy you got. This is the first garden I planted in the bottom left in my front yard, my pollinator garden, about 4 years ago. And it helped inspire the birth of this program. But you can create a garden of any size, from a window garden, a window box, up to thousands of square feet or into the acres even. But since we've launched this program in 2019, we have over 978 participants that have planted gardens at their homes across Tennessee, totaling over 148,000 square feet of pollinator habitat. That's new habitat that's been created in the last 3 years, thanks to your efforts joining the program. So that pollinator garden I did in the lower left corner there, that's the before picture. That's when I carved it out by hand. That's my spade in the photo. And then that's what it looked like a couple months later that same year. I was so pleased and excited that was able to create some beauty, take some lawn and create a beautiful flower garden that has more ecological diversity. So I'm going to scroll through some of the more recent gardens, the larger gardens we've created as an organization with crews of volunteers. This one is in the city of Lebanon, that city of Lebanon approved using some of their land. Hopefully this is just the first of many. And this garden was sponsored by Royal Canin, who helped pay for the cost of building the garden, plus sent a crew of volunteers out there on a blustery day where it was snowing and sleeting, but we built that 2,000 plus square foot garden back in April this year. This is a 200 square foot garden built by SSMV. They found the location, they got permission from the landowner to carve this garden. And that's what it looked like when it was planted in April. And some of the students there are with the School for Science and Math at Vanderbilt, SSMV. But this is what it looks like this spring, from planting it to growing. And this is the vision right here. I want to show you some before and after photos, because this is the transformation from lawn to habitat that we are encouraging you to do. This is Stratford STEM, where we had corporate teams from HCA, Amazon, Dell, UBS, and numerous community volunteers, City Service Mission, which is a volunteer organization. This is before they got to work on that day in October last fall. Sod removed and replaced with topsoil that we purchased, and seeds from Roundstone, the key partner in this whole effort. And that was done in about 3 hours, by the way, maybe 4. Actually, it was a 6-hour workday. It's getting longer. But this is the garden yesterday. I took this photo yesterday. And so the flowers are growing. It looks a bit wild, but that's what a habitat looks like, especially at first. And this is just next to that garden, the long view under the power lines of Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA power lines. We want to see these habitats go on as far as the eye can see, but this is all at the Stratford STEM campus, high school in East Nashville. And this is the anchor garden, we call it, on Stratford STEM campus. If you walk down Porter Avenue at Stratford, you will see this right before you go back into the residential zone. And this is, I think, my favorite garden of all those that we've planted so far, other than the ones in my front and backyard. Why I like this one is because it has the most robust growth that we've seen, the most diverse, balanced diversity of the species have grown and are flowering now. So it's a beautiful garden. And so this is our Cornelia Fort Trailhead project in the Shelby Bottoms Greenway and Nature Park. Corporate teams there included Flightview, Cummins, Beam Suntory, and numerous community volunteers. This is the lawn, the grass before we got started. This is after the volunteer day when we removed the sod and replaced it with topsoil. This one is about a 3,500 square foot garden. We left that grass in the middle so people could walk out and enjoy the garden. And I'm going to flip around and do a reverse view here to show what has become one of the more perplexing aspects in our view of planting these gardens is they don't always grow at the rate we hope or would like them to. And but before I show that, here's a close-up of the flowers that I took yesterday. So yes, they are flowering, the Cornelia Fort gardens as well. But this is what I was talking about. There's our walkway in the middle, our pathway, and on the left you can see this robust growth, and on the right it's sparse growth. There is growth and there's a lot of stuff growing in there, but it's a clear difference, and it's mysterious because we planted this thing on the same day. So the climate conditions were the same, the day was the same, The soil was installed. It was the same soil mix across the whole garden, the same seed mix across the whole thing. And yet half of it is doing super well and the other half is taking its time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that here as I introduce Monica Pretz, the field volunteer coordinator for these gardens, and explain some of the growth patterns of these gardens. And also to remind you, if you're feeling a little bit underwhelmed by the progress of your garden at this point, don't despair. If you look real close, you'll probably see things growing, and just give them the time they need to reach maturity. I'm not going to steal the thunder from Monica, and she will explain more about what we're talking about in her portion of the presentation. So Monica, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. So I'm going to talk about the pollinator habitat, how we establish it a little bit more detailed than Jeffrey did. And then I will move on to the basic wildflower identifications. And I'll talk a little bit about the pollinators and the birds that they bring into our gardens. Can you, next slide, please, Jeff? But before I start, I want to quickly introduce you to some terms that we use. So all of our gardens, we plant herbaceous plants, which means these plants are non-woody plants. So the above ground growth will largely or totally die back for the winter time. Herbaceous plants can be in 3 different groups. Annual plants are the ones which life cycle is a single year, which means they germinate, they bloom, they set seed and die back completely for the winter time. And next year they will start again from seeds. Biennial plants are plants that life cycle has 2 years, which means they will germinate and grow in the first year, but they will only flower in the second year. Now, perennial plants are the plants that live more than 2 years. And they will germinate, grow the first year. Some of them will flower first year. Some of them will only flower second or third year as they mature. They also die back for the winter, but because they keep their root system alive in the soil, they will have a robust return next year. Our presentation will focus mostly on perennial plants, as they are the ones that sometimes you have to wait and sometimes you have to monitor how they grow. I quickly would like to mention the word germination. Germination is the process of the single seed, which is an embryo, emerging little seedlings too. Germination is very heavily influenced by environmental factors, and that can be seen in many of our gardens. It is really influenced by the weather, about the oxygen level and the light, the temperature of the area of the soil, and also the water, how much water it receives. Next slide, please. When we are talking about establishing a pollinator garden, we are always talking about the first 3 to 5 years. And that is because the first year of development in a pollinator garden is mainly focusing on root development. The above ground vegetative growth remains sometimes slow, and it is most of the time the annual plants that produce the flowers, while perennials sometimes take more time. Of course, as Jeff mentioned to you, the first year when we establish a garden, we focus on removing the weeds, removing invasive species. And depending on the garden, really, we see that some gardens has a much more return of the weeds and grasses, and some garden needs some mowing to cut back the fast return, the fast growing grasses. In case you have a garden like this, we suggest to cut it back to 6 to 8 inches tall. But we would like to suggest to be careful with compacting the soil, because root development is the most important this time. The second year in perennial gardens, perennial plants, is mostly called as a foliage growth. Our plants will return after the winter and they will have a more robust growth. And in this time, you will probably see more flowers coming up during the spring, summer, and fall time. This is still a time when we want to focus on the weeds returning into our garden. We want to still reduce the competition until our plants get stronger. So we usually suggest cutting back the weeds to a 10 to 12 inch height. In both years, depending really on your garden, you might be able to do some manual weeding, pulling out the weeds, but we would really suggest caution not to disturb the little plants that are growing, that we are wanting to grow.
And Monica, when you say cut back, you mean like after the dormancy in the fall, right?
No, here I'm talking about cutting back in the spring and the summer time when the weeds are fast growing and they may compete the water supply or the light for our plants. Now in 3rd and 4th, 5 years, I would like to mention really cutting or not cutting actually back our flowers for the winter time. So the 3rd year is really the flower production when it's starting. And after our plants flowered and they set their seeds or die back for the winter, it is very important that leave that plant material standing. This will supply food for the winter bird residents, but it will also supply overwintering insect habitat with their hollow stems. Many of the caterpillar fall down to the soil and hibernate in the soil. Now, I understand that in some areas, for example, I live in a neighborhood where it might be difficult for leaving that plant standing throughout the whole winter, but that is our aim. That is the best way to do it. But in case you cannot do, I probably would suggest to cut it back and keep them in a loose bundle, upright, somewhere in the back of your yard. So the insect will be able to emerge, come alive, come back in the spring, the very first warm spring mornings and spring days when the temperature is above 60. And then after that, you can mulch it, you can compost it, but until then, try to keep it as safe as possible. And 4 or 5 years, you will see a mature pollinator garden with more butterfly, more insect, and more mature, larger plants and higher diversity. Next slide, please. So it is indeed one of the biggest questions that we get is how do I know that my garden is successful? And because very often people come and say, oh, it's just the weeds returning, it's just the grass is returning to the plot, nothing is growing. And I would like to suggest to use a technique that ecologists often use, diversity metrics, to determine the stability and the health of an ecosystem. We slightly change this because we are not interested in every single species that is growing there, but I call it a target species count, which is basically you identify and count the wildflowers that you planted, that you want to grow. And I would suggest to use a unit for this, which can be a 1 yard by 1 yard, or it can be a step by a step, and really get down to your plants and look at what you have there. And what you should do is count the number of species in this unit area and count the specimen in this area. Now, as Jeffrey showed an image before at the former Cornelia Fort Air Park, is the garden may vary in different areas how much growing you get. So I usually suggest to pick 3 to 5 sites to have a good overview of the plants you are growing. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to give you some help with how to identify the species that you have and how to count the wildflowers growing in your garden. So this plot is actually 1 square yard area from Stratford STEM High School, one of the gardens which we considered one of the weediest garden, and we were concerned about this garden. So I would say it is always good to have a book that helps you identifying the species, but now everyone has an iPhone or some kind of phone that you can download an app. It will save a lot of time for you, it will help you, and it will provide a lot of information for you. So always try to use an app. And I also suggest to get down really to the plant and use your senses. So for example, in this plot, the first plant I picked is in the little circle. It was a black-eyed Susan. And I picked this because it was already bringing the blooms. And my suggestion, when you want to identify a species, pick one plant, the most abundant one. First of all, with your eyes, check the leaf shape. Is it an oval? Is it linear? Is it oblong? And then you can look at the edges of the leaves. Is it entire, or is it toothed or serrate? But further on, please use your senses, use your touch the leaves. So for example, this is a black-eyed Susan. It has very soft leaves. So I didn't need it to identify all the black-eyed Susans. I just went around in my little square to touch all the plants. And with that technique, I could very easily identify that there were more than 12 black-eyed Susan just in one square yard. Now, other thing that you can do, you can pinch a little bit the leaves. You can identify by the smell, or does it have a milky substance coming out? So overall, I would suggest to look at your garden. Here in just one square yard, I could see a lot of different species, actually more even that is really required in such a small area. Next slide, please. So the other question is really, when you identified your little wildflowers, to weed or not to weed your area. And I think this is the question that comes down to what is the aim of the landowner? What is the aim of the gardener? What is your aim personally? Tennessee Environmental Council aims to restore a healthy and balanced ecosystem, which is a habitat for pollinators. So we do not necessarily want to remove all the weeds in our gardens. But of course, if you have a little pollinator garden in your front yard or backyard and you are aiming to reduce more unwanted plants, then you can do that. I always suggest, if you pull the weeds, be very careful not to disturb the root system of the wildflowers. Removing weeds, yes.
I wanted to add one thing. I was out at one of our gardens yesterday, and I pulled some invasive grass out, a big clump, and at the same time it pulled out one of the plants that we had put in there from seed. So it is that's why we don't like to weed in general, but
yes,
the personal preference. So I'm sorry, you may continue.
Thank you. So reducing competition in the first year is important. When the plants are, as you said, are more developed, it's much better not to pull the weeds, but maybe just cut back the weeds. Also, I want to mention that in a healthy, balanced ecosystem, there is no good or bad actors. So even the grasses that, for example, are fast growing in the garden, in your front yard or in our pollinator garden, have benefits for our garden. You can see it in this picture. Grasses are excellently catching early morning dew, and as the water trickles down to the root system of the grass, it will also feed our black-eyed Susan or the coneflowers. Weeds are the name that we call for these plants. Many of the plants that we plant, like the milkweed or the butterfly weed, are called weed, but they are called weed because the first people coming from Europe to America identified these plants, and as they had no agricultural use, they called them weeds. But now we are looking at them as our beautiful wildflowers. Next slide, please. So as Jeff said, it is the first and most important thing to remove invasive species as well as you can, because they will quickly overtake your garden. Invasive plants are non-native plants that are fast growing and fast spreading and overpopulating natural areas. So always remove those. However, I would like to mention that there are some native plants which might be considered as weeds, like the little black magic in the same little spot that I was identifying the wildflowers. Black magic is a native plant. It's everywhere in North America. It was actually a food source for Native Americans. And it is a wonderful little yellow flower loved by bees and pollinators. And I just learned that it's an excellent source for honey. So it's a question, we decided to leave it. Is it a good soil cover plant? And our pollinators love it and they will come. The other question is, of course, introduced or naturalized species. You can see on the right-hand side, one of our pollinator garden, the berms which we create as erosion control were totally overcome by spreading hedge parsley and also by wild carrots. These plants are not native to Tennessee, not native to United States, but they are not really considered invasive. In the same time, they are loved by pollinators because their umbo shape of flower is an excellent landing spot for pollinators and especially butterflies, and it's like a food supermarket for them. So we decided to leave them on the side of our gardens. Next slide, please. Now, this is the time I really want to mention that all of the seeds that we use in our pollinator gardens are native, Tennessee native wildflowers and keystone plant seeds. So native plants are important because they are the one who evolved in the native environment. They tolerate the local conditions. Most of them are drought tolerant. Usually their root system go much deeper into the soil. That way they help a healthy soil, they stabilize the soil, and they manage rainwater runoff. They also important because they evolved together with the native pollinators, the native bees, all the bees that are specialized bees and require special pollens for feeding their young ones. The other part of native plants are the keystone plants. Keystone plants for pollinators are important because they are critical for the food web, and they are critical for the completion of the life cycle of our pollinators. You can see in this picture, I listed some of the keystone plants that support really large numbers of caterpillars, butterflies, and pollinator bees. Next slide, please.
Hey, Monica, I wanted to briefly add for our audience that the seed mixes we provide in the Generate Some Buzz program have about 20 to 30 different flower and grass, native flowers and grasses that benefit the pollinators. So, so there are multiple species in each seed packet. That's why these gardens are quite robust and diverse.
Thank you. Yes, that's very important for diversity. So the first plant that I would like to help you with the identification is a keystone plant. It supports, Black-eyed Susan supports 20 butterfly and 29 specialist bees. The leaves of the Black-eyed Susans, as I mentioned before, is really soft to touch. This is one of the easiest way, I think, for me to identify is by touching the plant. They are kind of long lanceolate and prominently veined. The flowers are beautiful black and dark brown central cone that is surrounded with rich yellow petal-like rays. Now, this is a perennial plant again, and this is one of the plants that flowers quite early, usually first year, and it will flower through June to September, and it loves full sun. Next one, please. So Black-eyed Susan is absolutely loved among bees, honeybees, and mason bees. Now, honeybees are not native to America, North America. They are introduced from Europe, but we have about 139 different native mason bees in North America. Mason bees are small, stingless bees, and many of them live solitary, and they nest in different substrates, like in tunnels bored by other beetles. They nest in plant stems. So for example, for them, it is very important to leave the dead plant material in the winter standing. And they are specialized and evolved together with the native plants. So many mason bees require, and all bees actually require, the pollen to feed the young bees. And Black-eyed Susan will invite other pollinators like the red admiral butterfly. But you will see in your garden that it's not only the pollinator that comes to the plant, but their predators too. The little jagged ambush bug, which camouflages itself perfectly into this plant, will eat and catch small bees and butterflies 3 times its size. So you will see a whole ecosystem evolving in your garden. Next slide, please.
Hey, there's another interesting factoid that mason bees and solitary bees, which are native to our region, are 10 times more effective at pollinating than the honeybees, 10 times more effective. So very interesting factoid that the native bees are really the most important ecologically in our region.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So the next keystone plant that I would like to introduce you is the Maximilian sunflower. There are several Helianthus species. I'm talking about this one because this is in our seed mix. The leaves are long, narrow. They kind of alternate and a little bit coarse to the touch. The flowers are bright yellow and they are growing in large number. This plant can go up to 7 to 10 feet tall. And this is, as I said, a keystone plant. It is a host plant for 66 butterfly and 50 bees. And it will flower in mid-summer, so mostly July through all the way to October. And it absolutely tolerates drought. So it's perfect for the dry, hot days that we are experiencing right now. And I would like you to focus for a second on the leaves. So the leaves are long and narrow. Now, please, Jeff, give me the next slide, which is another sunflower. This is the false sunflower. Leaves are simple, they appear opposite, and the margins are toothed. This is also, it belongs to another family, the Heliopsis, but the flowers are very similar, bright yellow flowers, and they also grow in large number. This plant grows a little bit smaller, and it will flower also from July to August. So if you have it in your garden or if it is growing in your new garden, it might flower this year, but it will just come. It still needs time. And it also loves dry soil. Next slide, please. Now, goldenrod is the #1 most important keystone species among herbaceous plants. The goldenrod supports 104 caterpillar and butterfly species, and it also supports 42 different bee pollinators. The leaves are lance-shaped and finely toothed, and the flowers are really small, but they have these elongated clusters. And this plant is very important not only for pollinators, but also it provides food for migrating birds in the fall. It will flower in the late summer and throughout the fall up to November. Next.
Monica, can I say one thing?
Yes.
A lot of people think that goldenrod causes bad allergies, but the reality is that the goldenrod pollen is so very large and heavy that it very rarely becomes airborne and it falls down, and it is actually not a problem for people with allergies. So it makes a great plant for your yard.
Thank you very much for adding that, because it's a very important point. Thank you. Yes, next slide, please. Okay, another little yellow flower, Coreopsis. So as the goldenrod was blooming in the fall, Coreopsis, one of the early flowers, it will bloom in April, May to June. When it starts to grow in your garden, it will appear in small clumps. I think that one of the easiest way to identify lance-leaf Coreopsis is by the leaves. When they are very young, they don't have these leaflets, but as they are growing, the leaves will have this deep cut and form these 3 leaflets. And the flowers are beautiful yellow flowers, and it is loved by bees. But here I would like to mention that although this is a perennial plant, sometimes it's not that reliable depending on the soil conditions, but it will self-sow its seeds. Next one, please. Okay, the next one is purple coneflower. And I think this is the plant that I heard from most people that their favorite one. And it is indeed a super reliable plant, reliable perennial, returning year after year, producing these wonderful, beautiful lavender flowers. But I would like to mention, if you are just starting, this is a plant that grows very slowly in the first year. So to identify the leaves, they are simple, alternate dark green, and they are really rough to touch. And purple coneflower do not flower in the first year. It will really focus on root development and the foliage. I think for me, it's the third year when I usually get nice flowers. So it requires some patience, but then you will have gorgeous blooms in year 2, 3, 4. Next slide, please. Of course, purple coneflower will attract a lot of bumblebees and butterflies. But this is a point I would like to mention because purple coneflower is also loved by finches. And that brings me to the question, as a gardener, do you want to deadhead your flowers or you want to leave your plants? Gardeners usually suggest to deadhead the flowers, which means you cut off the stem, the spent flowers, and that will stimulate your perennial to produce more flowers. But if you could just leave some of the seed heads, you will have an absolute joy as the goldfinch male and female come together in your yard, and they will enjoy your flowers. So it's a question again to gardeners. What is your aim in your garden? Do you want to have a longer flowering season, or you want to enjoy diversity in all kinds of animals and plants? Next slide, please. Common milkweed, one of the favorite of people and well known to be the important host plant for the butterfly, the monarch butterfly. I think the most important to mention about common milkweed, about identification, that the leaves are thick, they are kind of hard, and they have a prominent midrib. Also, this is a plant, when you pinch the leaves, it will have a milky latex, which contains cardiac glycoside compound. And that is why many butterfly caterpillars don't eat it. But the monarch butterfly and the queen butterfly use this plant as a host plant, and this is essential for the caterpillars. This is also important to say that it flowers in June, July, August, and it is an absolute sun-loving plant, but it requires some moisture in the soil. And I now mentioned the common milkweed, but there is also the swamp milkweed that is the same host plant, but it prefers really wet soil. It can even live in small ponds. Next slide, please. And then here are the monarch butterfly and the monarch caterpillar. So the caterpillar uses the cardiac glycoside as a protection against being eaten by birds. It's a toxic chemical. But the butterflies will come to the plant, and you can see clearing moss and also red milkweed beetle, and many other pollinators will come to the milkweed. Yes, next slide, please.
Hey, Monica, I want to add there will be a time for Q&A at the end. I know some people are starting to put some chat comments in the chat, but we will do some Q&A at the end of the presentation. Just FYI.
Okay, the next one is the butterfly weed. Butterfly weed loves to be in poor, sandy, and dry soil. So whenever you have a garden which you don't want to water, this is a perfect plant for you. The leaves are alternating and simple dark green leaves, and it has a stunningly beautiful orange flowers. The flowers are long lasting, and it mainly blooms in May through September and attracts a lot of butterflies. And that will be seen in the next slide, please. You see, the butterflies love this plant. This is again a plant that is called weed because that's how it was first identified and classified, but it is a beautiful wildflower, and it attracts, for example, the zebra swallowtail butterfly, which is our state butterfly. If you would like to have zebra swallowtail in your garden, I would definitely suggest to plant this plant. But I would also recommend to plant the pawpaw tree, because pawpaw tree is the host plant for the caterpillar of zebra swallowtail. And I would love to mention that you can get these trees from Tennessee Environmental Council next year in Tennessee Tree Day in March, and you can probably register the end of fall for our program. But this plant will invite many more butterflies in your garden. I would like to mention the queen butterfly on the right below corner, yes, there, which also the host plant for this butterfly is also the milkweed, the previous plant, and which is because this butterfly is a close relative to the monarch butterfly. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the plant and one of the wildflower, which is very well known and always considered as a common weed, is the region or common yarrow. You can see the leaves are very delicate, fern-like, lacy appearance. It has many small leaflets on each side of the midrib. The flower itself has these beautiful clusters of small flowers, and because of that it is loved for butterflies. It's an easy landing for them, and they can enjoy the plant very much. And it's a wonderful nectar source for them. Yes, next slide, please. So I would like to finish the wildflower identification with this plant, which is evening-primrose. So evening-primrose is a plant which is not a perennial plant, but I kind of expect people to, it is a fast-growing plant, but it is a biannual plant. So it means it will only grow leaves and stem in the first year, and then it will die back. And after the winter, it will return with a rapid growth, and it will produce these beautiful, delicate yellow flowers. And this evening primrose is a interesting plant because it's not only flowers in the second year, but also it flowers in the late afternoon, evening, and it's a host plant for nocturnal animals like mosses. And the next slide, I would like to show you some of the animals that it will bring into your garden, like the, I think, stunningly beautiful pink primrose moth, which is, again, a nocturnal moth. The caterpillars will eat the plants, and the moth itself will come and enjoy the flowers. But evening primrose will invite other nocturnal animals like the sphinx or hawk moth. And in the afternoon, it will feed the hummingbirds. Hummingbirds will come to enjoy the nectar of these delicate flowers. This is the moment, although I would like to mention that hummingbirds are not only eating nectars, which is just sugar water, they really require insect for their growth and for the muscle development. So they eat a lot of aphids, they eat mosquitoes, and the other animal that this plant will invite in your garden are the bats, because they will come because of the nocturnal moths, and bats also eat hundreds of mosquitoes, actually 6,000 to 8,000 mosquito insects in one night. Next slide, please. So some of our garden, as Jeff showed to you, are still in early stages, and they might not flower yet, or they are just heading to have their first flowers, but they are already habitats for many of the caterpillars. And I would like to point out the importance of caterpillars and not to use insecticides in our gardens. Our birds, 90% of the baby birds' food are caterpillars. Caterpillars are very nutritious. They are soft. They are full of carotenoids. And carotenoids are very important for vertebrates. It's important for the eyesight. It's important for the colorful feather. It is important for the immune system. And here are some of the birds that if you have these caterpillars in your garden, they will join you. And for example, even the hummingbirds, I would like to mention that it eats a lot of small insects, and especially for the babies, it's important for the muscle development and to be able to fly as it flies, to have amino acids and proteins in their diet. Our habitats, our pollinator habitats, are not only providing insect and food, but we also provide protected nesting areas. You can see on the right side the killdeer mama that Jeffrey made the picture of, protecting the little nest that was at the former Cornelia Fort Air Park. And our garden was surrounded by a fence, so it was not cut down in any way. So this little nest was protected from the elements. Next slide, please. And finally, I would like to mention some of the resources that we have. So we always use non-GMO and non-modified plants and seeds. We always suggest to use native plant seed companies. Our partner is Randstone Native Seeds, and we also order seeds from American Meadows. It is very important, if you have the chance, to buy your native plants from native plant nurseries. Some of the big companies like Home Depot or Lowe's might have some so-called native plants, but those plants are cultivars, which means they were modified to have maybe bigger flower or more stronger colors or faster growth. And those things, especially the flower modification, the different color, can modify the pollens, which are the essential feeding source for bees, young bees. And it can modify the shape, the size, or the amino acid content of the pollens. So we suggest to try to buy your plants in person or online from these companies. There are several listed here in Middle Tennessee. For the identification of the wildflowers, I think it saves a lot of time and energy to use applications from your mobile phones. I use Picture This. I find it very reliable source, but there are other sources as well, other applications. Most of them has a limited, just maybe a 1 month trial period where you can use it for free. And if you like it, then you might need to pay for it, but if you don't like it, you can delete it. And I think that was my last slide, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I wanted to just remind everyone that all the flowers that Monica shared in her slides there are available in the seed mixes at Generate Some Buzz, as well as a lot of other good information. And you can review all the species in each seed mix prior to selecting which one you want. All those buttons are on the tectn.org/generate-some-buzz.
And I would like to just add one more thing, that all these seed mixes are prepared that you have a year-round flowering, because some of the flowers will start early in the spring, some will flower in the summer, and there will be flowers, wildflowers that will flower in a late fall, providing food before hibernation.
So check out our website, tectn.org/generate-some-buzz. Get your seeds to sign up. It's not a great time of year to plant, but you can plant them now. It's just they're the germination and blooming will happen really late in the season, maybe not even before the frost. So you can start planning for getting your garden ready in the fall as well. Choose your spot. You can dig it, carve it, get the soil in there, maybe put some plugs from a local nursery in there so you'll get some instant growth. But I do want to say thank you, Monica, for the excellent presentation and the scientific aspects of what we're trying to accomplish here. And if you have a question, before we get to Q&A, I did want to say one easy way to support this program and the continued work of Tennessee Environmental Council in expanding, we want to double that square footage in the next year. So that's our goal, and you can do it with your help. If you want to just earmark your community rewards points on your Kroger card, if you shop at Kroger, we'll get points and actually a donation from Kroger once a quarter. And so it won't cost you anything and it won't even take away your points, but it will add points every time you shop to TEC. So check out on tectn.org/give for instructions on how to do that. We're not going away yet. Don't leave yet, because we're opening it up for question and answer. Gwendolyn Blanton will be facilitating the Q&A portion. And Monica and I are, I'm going to stop my screen share. Monica and I are here to answer your questions. So Gwen, do you want to go ahead and check out the questions in the Q&A there?
Yes, we have a question from someone who says, I did not thin out my seeds, so I have a thicket of evening-primrose surrounded with black-eyed Susans. Should I thin out the primrose? And I don't actually know if you should or not, but I would look at the way it's growing and just, I would start by leaving it there. The black-eyed Susan will eventually get pretty tall, so it might actually outgrow it, and you'll have those diverse layers. Some things are taller, some things are shorter, and they all work together to shade the soil, which helps keep the soil cool and also helps retain moisture when it hasn't rained for a while. So I would start by not thinning and just let it go and see what happens and pay attention. If it looks like the primrose is totally crowding out the black-eyed Susan, you might try pulling a couple, but I would start by just watching it and letting it see what it wants to do. Unless, do you have something to add to that, Erica?
Maybe I just don't
Monica?
know if it's the second year or first year for the evening primrose, because it's a biennial. So after the second year, if it is flowering this year, it will die anyway. So next year it will come back from seeds, and that might be an easier time to remove it if it's too much. But I think many of these plants will compete for the sites, and you will see who wins. That is the natural way, actually, that sometimes a whole head of the seed will fall to one spot, and the strongest plant will find the most resources.
Right.
Hey, and I want to jump in. There's one more thing I want to share as well, because I know a lot of you have already planted your gardens. But this is a participatory program, as all of our programs are, and we have created a curriculum as well as a guide to not only planting your own garden, and that's what this guidebook put together by the School for Science and Math at Vanderbilt in partnership with our organization and staff. But we do have a guide for how you can even identify other potential locations in your community, at a church, a local business, a park, and how you go through the steps of getting permission and doing spreading this concept all throughout our community. So we want to encourage everyone to do their part. So, but if you want that guidebook, we're putting the finishing touches on it. Feel free to send an email through our website and make a request for it.
Okay, we have another question from Juliana. And she says, I think she might have audio texted this question in, because it looks like it's been auto corrected, but I think she's asking, she wants to put wildflowers in a flooding place, a flooding area in her yard. And can she do that, or how can she do that? And there are many plants that actually prefer more moisture. So I don't think that any of our seed mixes are specifically designed for the wetter areas, but a lot of times we call it a rain garden when you put your wildflower garden in an area that naturally gets more water, whether it's your gutter that just flows to that area or the natural curvature of the land just brings all of your rainwater to that area. There are plenty of plants, the swamp milkweed,
Yes.
Joe Pye weed, goldenrod loves water, elderberries love water. There are a bunch of plants that are flowering that are great native plants for our pollinators. So yes, you can totally do that. Just takes, you'll have to just pick your seed packet. And we are working on getting a wetland packet worked up for our Generate Some Buzz campaign, but we haven't gotten there yet.
And along the same line, someone did ask a question in the chat if the seeds and the plants that we offer thrive in full sun, and the answer is absolutely. These plants prefer full sun, but they can do, I think they need 6 hours or more of sunlight during the day.
Another question is, I sowed seeds in early June. How frequently should I be watering at this point? And my answer to that is I would water at least once a week, maybe twice, just because it has been so hot and so dry. And at the point where your seed finally breaks its seed coat and starts to germinate, that is when it is actually very delicate, and it needs to have that moisture level so that it can, first it's going to send a root into the ground and start working on its root system development before it starts sending up plant growth up into the air. So you want to make sure that it is getting some water, especially in this hot, dry time. And I think it's supposed to rain this weekend, but if you haven't watered your garden yet, I would go ahead and water it.
And I'd like to add to that. I am a believer that these are native seeds. They are adapted to our climate. And we selected native seeds for a reason, because we don't want people to have to water gardens, and because it takes time and energy, and also it robs the plants of going through their natural cycles. So if you ever can't water it for some reason, they're less adapted. But, and FYI, yeah, Gwen, you mentioned it is, there's rain predicted beginning tomorrow and all next week. So I've actually resisted watering the garden I'm looking at right now, and the plants are wilted, but they are alive and doing well and flowering, and the pollinators are flying around. And I intentionally pay attention to the weather. I encourage you to do that as well. If it's going to rain in the next few days and all next week, I would say just give it a chance. And but again, like Gwen said, it depends on when you planted the seeds. If they're still germinating, that's a critical time for them to get some moisture.
If I may quickly just mention, if you feel that you are super inspired by this presentation, I would love to ask you to hold your horses and maybe don't start right now your pollinator garden in July, but wait a little bit until the fall or next spring, because July can be really hot, and starting right now with the germination is tricky, and it does require then watering. Yes. Maybe start with planning and look into our seed packets, which one and which part of your garden you want, and just hold your horses for a little longer.
And that's another reason we encourage you to plant in the fall after things have gone dormant. So first of all, your seeds are not going to germinate in October or November and then die right away, because it starts freezing. If you plant in late November after the first frost, then those seeds will stay dormant all season long. They'll get a lot of moisture all winter long. So you can plant, the ideal time to plant is anytime between the first frost in November all the way through into April, May, and June. And then you'll have to apply very minimal water to the gardens. In fact, no water, because you get rain and snow throughout the cold season. And then they come up strong when they start blooming and sprouting in May, June, July.
Okay, we have one more question. Well, we have another question here back from Juliana. She says the area floods when the creek fills from the rains. So we will post a list of water-loving plants. If you just want it to be a flower garden, a pollinator garden, you could just choose rain garden plants, which there are a lot of rain garden plants, and we will post a list on our website if we don't already have one up there. And if you are okay with a bushier type aspect, you could use silky dogwoods. They are great willow trees, which are become a more tree-like thing, but they're the native willow, the black willow, is one of the most important keystone species, but it is actually more like a tree. So we don't plant it in our flower gardens, in our pollinator gardens, but it is great for edges of creek banks and swamp areas for things. It can totally tolerate being completely inundated. And we have another question here from Tad. Does very high solar radiation have any effect on these plants? And if so, is there anything I can do about it?
I would say that plants evolve to turn the leaves, so they know exactly what is the level of solar energy that they need, how much sun they need, and they can turn the leaves in a way that they prefer. Of course, if you see that your plants start to wilt, then you might water them. It's really depending on the garden that you have. Is it your little garden in your front yard, or is it a bigger area for pollinators and you are unable to? But these plants are native plants, and they evolved to the native conditions.
Now, there's a great question in the chat about removing the sod by hand. It is labor intensive, yes. You can rent a sod cutter from Home Depot or Lowe's and make it a lot easier for yourself. But the question is, what is your opinion on smothering with cardboard? Yes, that is actually a valid approach. If you have a lot of cardboard and want to just lay it out on the grass, it'll actually prevent, first of all, it prevents the grasses from growing up. They will eventually die. And then if you put soil on top of the cardboard, at least 2 to 3 inches, then you can plant the seeds on top of that soil, which is on top of the cardboard, which is on top of your sod. It will minimize that weed growth from the bottom, and it will allow those seeds to grow. And then the other part of the question is about prescribed burning, which on larger plots, that is a valid approach. After 3 to 5 years, then you can.
Yeah, but I think it really has to be careful about where is your plot, where is your garden. I don't think you're allowed to do any burning close to cities or inside cities.
Yeah, that's a technique for farmland in areas, out in the countryside. Yes. But it's a valid approach, but you definitely want to make sure you do it with all the local regulations. So we're not going to encourage you to do that unless you're an expert in that area. Now, TWRA, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, does have expertise in controlled burn. So if you want to do that one, I would suggest you definitely contact them first. But again, it's only for really large acreages, not 100 or 200 or 300, even 1,000 or 2 square feet. Yes, you can plant in midsummer. That's the question. But I think we answered that, why are spring and fall recommended, because it's cooler. The seeds are not going to germinate, but they will get a lot of rain and moisture all winter long. So they are ready to germinate when nature calls in the spring. Great questions, y'all. Mm-hmm. And feel free, I don't know if you can email tectn.org, or you can ask questions in the future through our website. And join our email list if you haven't already, so that the next time we do a webinar, you will know when it's coming up. And all that is, you can do all that on our website, tectn.org. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat.
Jeff, there's another question here in the Q&A. Do you recommend placing bee hotels in or near your pollinator gardens? Is this necessary or is it desired? And I think that it is nice to have bee hotels, but a lot of people are bringing up the point, you don't want to have a huge hotel. It's better to have a much smaller hotel for the bees to live in. That way, if they're attacked by a pest or a predator, they don't get all the bees at once. And so rather than having a large bee hotel, it's better to have a bunch of smaller ones. And one thing you can do is just by leaving areas of your ground that isn't mowed. And that's exactly what a pollinator habitat is. It provides an area of the soil for a lot of solitary bees to dig the burrows or to use someone else's burrow that someone else dug and to build their nests in there. So if you wanted to do a combination, if you want to put some bee hotels out, yes, definitely do that, but make sure they're the small ones with just a couple host sites for the bees.
And put it to a sunny side. So usually it should face south because that will keep the bees warm throughout the winter time when they are hibernating in it.
There's a great question from Marcella that they finally had their yard graded. So I imagine it's a larger area, several thousand square feet, I'm guessing. There's no sod to remove. That's a great time to plant the seeds, by the way. But if it's right now in the middle of summer, I'd say hold off on planting those seeds until the fall. Do we have any suggestions on how to cover and protect the area until planting? And
I think the cardboards are a good suggestions that they can do. Cover it with cardboards that will protect the area from unwanted weeds returning.
And erosion.
How big the area is, because you wouldn't want to have cardboard over a large yard, but if it's a small plot, definitely. And I don't have any good recommendations on what to cover it or protect it with until planting.
You could use compost.
There are actually like erosion control matting that is made out of burlap, so it's biodegradable and natural. You would have to spend some money on that, but I've seen that at Ace Hardware. And again, it depends on how much area there is and if you want cardboard or burlap. And then definitely I would encourage you to add some soil, even an inch.
On the top of the cardboard, it would stabilize the cardboard as well. Or just compost.
Well, we are over an hour, and I want to say thank you everybody for joining. On behalf of Tennessee Environmental Council, thank you. And thank you for planting your gardens and nurturing those habitats, enhancing the biological and ecological health of Tennessee and the world. It makes a difference when you do this, and we're pleased to be able to work with you. And make sure you post your pictures on the Facebook group if you're on social media. Generate Some Buzz is a Facebook group where we want to see your photos, and then you can ask questions there. You will definitely get some good answers by participating in that Facebook group. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and happy summer.